How did this story come to you in the first place and inspire you so much that you felt you needed to make a doc about it?
Yeah, so it goes back about 4 years ago. So we've been on this about 4 years, even though it's a story that goes maybe 60 years back. But Andrew Munger, who's a producer, documentary producer, he had the idea for this and had contacted Jay and then presented it to me as a director on it. And I, right away, I've got connections to the music and I'm really passionate about the music. So immediately we saw the same vision of this story and helping elevate these stories of Jay and his contemporaries and sort of the cultural influence the music has had on Canadian culture. I also did a 15-year radio show in one of Toronto's probably most predominant Caribbean programmed radio stations back in the day, which was CHRY 105.5 out of York University. And I played the original soul and funk and reggae and ska records. So I was always passionate about learning more about this music. I'm also Jamaican. My mom's from Jamaica. She came up a few years after Jay came up. She immigrated to Canada. So I've always grown up into music and just wanted to discover more of it and just realizing how much there was here in Canada, and that kind of went undiscovered.
Well, that's the point. I mean, you really were a pioneer in getting this music out there, and we're talking 50, 60 years ago right now. What was Toronto like back then?
That's a good question. What you was like, for example, when I came at that time, first thing I noticed was when I came through the custom, immigration.
You moved here as a teenager.
Yes, 1964, and my mom came 1954 as a domestic worker. And the questions that were asked of me at immigration, I knew I was in a new environment. And then looking outside, it was in the fall, no leaves on the trees. I said, why, the trees are dying. What happened here? But then again, it was nature, learning how to appreciate the different seasons.
Did you like Toronto when you first got here?
No.
What didn't you like about it?
I did not. I missed the food that I left in the Caribbean. And the cold, because I'm from a tropical climate. But as soon as I got here, my mom told me, she says, listen, you're gonna need an education. You need to go to school right away. So then my friend Henry Naylor introduced me to Central Technical High School.
You went to Central Tech?
Central Tech, only to find out it's the largest technical school in the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So large that in my first week I got lost. So they had to assign a kid to take me around. And then that helped me to adjust to the new environment. Like going around to the church halls on Sunday afternoons, singing with different bands, getting to know the city better. And then back at Central Tech, it was a school anniversary then, so I decided to go and check it out at the auditorium, and they were doing a concert for the anniversary. So I went in and saw a young man with a guitar say, hey man, can you help me? I would love to sing a song for the anniversary show tonight. He says, I don't know if I can play what you want, but what do you want to sing? So I go, they call it Stormy Monday, and Tuesday just as bad. Lord, Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy upon me. That was the blues. So I sang it at the anniversary show, and then they showed it the Monday morning to the whole school in the auditorium. Man, I was a star. Everybody wants, hey, Jay, hey, we got a band. So then I started playing in the church halls around the city.
Okay, well, that needs a follow-up, because as we said off the top, Jay Douglas is not the name you were born with. When and why did you take on the name Jay Douglas?
Man, that's a good question, brother. Ooh. No, that's the question. I'm happy you asked this, because in the documentary, it showed where a gentleman by the name of Rick Sands came up to me while we were doing a gig right here in a club called The Generator. It was the hardest club to get booked in because they weren't using local bands, American bands. So we got this gig, and before the opening night in the afternoon, the guys in the band start fighting. And we have a show to do, but I'm a peacemaker because where I came from, try to make peace, make things work. So I went up there and I worked my butt off, but the gentleman was at the back of the room, and when we took our first break, he said, "I want to speak to you. I'm Rick Sands. Come here." He says, "What's wrong with the band? You're working hard, but they're not with it. Were you guys having problems?" We're fighting. He says, "I want you to come and see me next week in my office." He was one of the top agents in Toronto. He says, I want to help you. I don't want the rest of the band. I want you because you're working hard. I said, "But I can't leave the Cougars, man. The Cougars are the..." He says, "Nobody knows you." And that's when I became J. Douglas.
There we go. Congestion pricing came in January in New York City. It now costs about $9 a day to enter New York during peak hours. The results are in. This is only for January 2025. Let's see what has happened. 1 million fewer vehicles entered the most congested part of Manhattan. Travel times 10 to 30% faster at inbound river crossings. Bus service was faster and more reliable. Ridership on the weekend express bus service grew by more than 20%. In the first 27 days, this program generated apparently almost $50 million, which will go to the region's transit system. And it's on track to hit $500 million by the end of the year, unless President Trump gets his way and he comes in and cancels this. Stay tuned, everybody. Okay, Jennifer, if there's fewer cars on the road now, what happened to all those drivers? Where'd they go?
Well, they're taking the bus. You just saw that in your stats. They're getting on the bus. More people are carpooling. More people are walking to their destinations. And people are changing their travel patterns. That's really one of the most significant things that happens with congestion pricing, is that people think differently about how they're going to commute, when they commute. It's interesting to be implementing this at a moment when most people do have the option, many people do have the option of working from home. So you start to see a big shift in how people think about their commute and when they commute and when they get in their car. You know, years ago when we were advocating for this in the city of Toronto, I was on the CBC and someone called in. You know, we were talking about the power of pricing and congestion relief zones, and someone called in and said, "If you do this, I'm going to have to start carpooling." That's the answer to your question.
And that is what you want.
That's the answer to your question, is
carpool.
that you change behavior by putting a price on something. And look, 20% increase in the number of people taking the bus in New York City. That is a really significant and transformative shift in modal split that transportation planners, you know, spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to tweak routes, how to improve service, how to get the pricing right in order to see that kind of a transition. So I think what we've seen, and we've already seen it for decades in London, and we've seen it in Singapore, and we've
London,
seen it
UK. They've
London,
had it.
UK, in Singapore, in Stockholm, is that when you introduce pricing, that you start to mix up how people think about using road infrastructure, and that's really powerful.
We should just say modal split is what people like you call those who drive versus those who take transit. Just a little translation there. Is this a good or bad news story?
The New York story is a great news story. It's working, and it's also changing minds and attitudes. When it first came in, people in New York City were generally opposed. You're starting to see the favorability go up. People see that it works, and that's been the pattern all around the world. London, Stockholm, Milan, Singapore. When these charging programs are first introduced, they're often unpopular. People are worried about how they are going to get around, if they're going to be priced off the road. And over time, when they see the results, that's what's so key about this. It's not just a new tax, it's actually improving and changing people's lives and experiences in cities. And when they start to see the positive results, then the favorability goes up, and people in polls and even in elections. In Stockholm, they had an election after it got brought in. Charging got brought in as a pilot, and afterwards they had an election, and it won, and it got maintained. So you can really start to see how people view their lives changing for the better, and these programs are working.
Teresa, same question. Is this a good or bad news story?
I think the New York story is a very interesting, because often we hear people say, "Oh, that's London," or "That's Singapore," but I think a lot of people in Toronto can feel more like-minded with New York City, right? It's a busy, bustling city, bigger than Toronto even. But and so I think people are gonna, once they hear about it, I don't think a lot of people in Toronto actually know about New York's congestion program. And then I think right now too, it's early. So people want to see some proof, and I think it's an interesting telltale for what could or could not happen in Toronto. That being said, there are some things that need to happen before you implement something like this.
So let me ask the obvious follow-up, which is you're here representing the Canadian Automobile Association. So do we assume that drivers are not happy about having to pay this money to go into the city?
Well, I think at CA, we always focus on safety, but we talk to our members about some of these issues like congestion pricing, how people get around. So our members get around by car, they get around by bike, they take transit, they walk, and we've definitely seen a huge shift in some of those ways of getting around since the pandemic. But in generally, if you ask people if they're supportive of tolls or congestion charges, no, they're not.
Right.
And I think that that's something that we've talked about over a number of years, is what has to be in place, because otherwise it's just seen as very punitive. And currently, we've got a lot of transit being built, which is really a precursor to how you get people to change their transportation behaviors or how they get around. But we don't have it where it needs to be yet in order to even bring in something at this point.
So Yan, let me ask you, how much appetite for a genuinely bilingual country are you picking up in the country these days?
Well, not much. In part because, let's be honest, to learn another language demands a real effort. I happen to learn the two, and I speak Spanish too, because I was living in those countries. I mean, you can't live 10 years in France without picking up French. You can't, if your parents speak French to you, necessarily learn French. And then I went to school in English. But otherwise, I said in Saskatoon, l'assimilation est galopante. It's very hard to speak French in Saskatoon. You can try to learn it in school, but then as soon as you leave the school, everything's in English. Radio, television, everyone on the street, sports, everything's in English. So it demands a real effort. Is there an appetite for that effort? I'm not sure. Other than in Quebec, and that's the one thing about separatism, is it took all of francophoneness to itself and abandoned everyone beyond the Quebec border. The federal government has made a valiant effort. Supposedly when you go to Canada Post, you can speak French. Well, you don't really, but they make that effort. But I don't think there's a real appetite, no. But is that the end of the world? I mean, let's take the example of the Irish or the Indigenous people, which is totally ignored in the Two Solitudes thing. Of course, they don't even talk about the Indigenous people. Many of them, the Irish and the Indigenous people of North America, have lost their native languages, and yet they didn't lose their culture necessarily. They're trying to bring that back. But can they bring back the dozens and dozens and dozens of Indigenous languages that were spoken in Canada? Probably not. But they can certainly rescue their culture. And to me, that's the essential thing. I disagree with what you said about the English and I mean, culture and language being together. English, for example, there's not one English, there's dozens of English. Jamaican English is totally different from, Australian English, from North American English. English is an example of a language as a tool that can adapt itself to any number of cultures, and any language can do that. So I think the Indigenous people of Saskatchewan, for example, speak wonderful English, but they're completely Indigenous. They're bringing back their indigeneity, but just happen to using the tool called English. They strip away all the English stuff out of it, but they use it as a tool to express themselves. I think there's real appetite for that, for cultural survival. Linguistic survival, the only province that I remember as a writer seeing as being genuinely bilingual was New Brunswick. That's the only place that I've done an event that was both in English et en français. J'ai fait un événement à Moncton.
Le Fry Festival.
Le Fry Festival. J'ai fait un événement qui était tout à fait bilingue. On posait une question en anglais, une question en français. Et les spectateurs devaient se débrouiller.
Could you say the same thing about French, though? The French I hear in Northern Ontario does not sound the same as the French I would hear in Quebec or in New Brunswick or in Paris, France.
Yeah, no. Every language can adapt to where it is. Like any animal, we adapt ourselves. So, but as I said, to keep a language alive demands a real... It's like learning an instrument. If you play the violin, it's great. You also want to learn the oboe? Go ahead. It's really hard.
Je vais juste être un peu en désaccord parce que l'expérience au Québec que moi je vois, et vous avez fait allusion à ça au début, c'est qu'il y a l'évolution de cette solitude culturelle, dans le sens qu'on ne peut pas apprécier la culture québécoise sans connaître le français. Parce que la télévision, la radio, les revues, tout qui est en français, si on n'est pas quelqu'un qui parle le français, si on n'est pas bilingue, on ne peut pas s'immerser dans la culture. Et je suis d'accord avec les communautés autochtones, c'est sûr qu'ils préservent la culture sans avoir la langue, mais même là, il y a une difficulté parce que la tradition est orale avec ces communautés. Ils n'ont pas d'écrits qui peuvent être traduits, par exemple. Il faut avoir quelqu'un qui parle pour savoir l'histoire l'histoire, qu'elle soit après peut-être transcrite en anglais. Alors là, il y a aussi un mouvement de ces communautés-là pour préserver la langue parce que pour pleinement apprécier la culture, une connaissance au moins de base de la langue est nécessaire. Et au Québec, on voit ça, on a tout un star system complètement différent que dans le reste du Canada, qui est en français. And the people who are in that star system, they are French speakers, but they can't be appreciated fully if you can't speak some French. So, and people won't watch. They won't watch TV if they're an English-speaking Quebecer. Sometimes they won't watch French TV because they can't
They don't get
engage.
it.
They don't get it. Yeah.
Puis je me demande si on pourrait être franco-ontarien sans parler français ou sans au moins comprendre le français, parce que ce qu'on produit comme culture, comme recherche, bien, ça se fait essentiellement en français et c'est très rarement traduit. Donc, qui perd la langue perd l'identité culturelle en grande partie. C'est pas nécessairement le cas en Acadie.
J'allais pour dire.
Où,
le Congrès mondial acadien, par exemple,
ça.
c'est un événement qui, dépendamment de la région où ça se tient, quand même
C'est ça.
bilingue.
C'est
Les
ça.
fêtes de famille,
Ouais.
avec justement des gens qui viennent de la Louisiane, notamment, ou de la Nouvelle-Angleterre. Souvent, c'est des gens qui ont perdu le français
ça.
depuis plusieurs générations, mais qui se réclament encore de
Ouais.
l'identité
C'est ça.
acadienne. Mais il
Au
reste
niveau-
que pour participer à la société civile acadienne
Ouais.
aujourd'hui, si on ne parle pas français, on va rester très marginal.
C'est ça. Et c'est la différence avec l'Ontario français, qui a une identité qui est très civique, très peu ancrée dans l'ethnicité canadienne-française. Donc, on va entendre dire des gens « My parents were French » or « My grandmother was French but I'm not French », right? Even if they are Franco-Ontarian ethnically, for example.
Est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas sensibiliser les anglophones au risque qu'encourt la langue française de disparaître s'il n'y a pas un cadre pour la protéger?
La question est bonne et c'est une réflexion que je me suis souvent faite, par exemple, par rapport au programme d'immersion. On sait qu'il y a des écoles d'immersion partout au Canada. Les parents font la ligne pour avoir une place pour leurs enfants. Mais, par exemple, les chansons qu'on apprend, les comptines qu'on apprend à ces petits-enfants-là ne sont pas les comptines que nous, on a appris dans les écoles françaises, par exemple. C'est comme si on avait créé une culture francophone pour les petits anglophones du Canada qui veulent apprendre le français. Et ça me sidère. On a des belles comptines. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on ne les partage pas? Et il y a, je pense, des associations culturelles sur le terrain qui font cet effort-là. Je pense, par exemple, au Théâtre français de Toronto ici, qui présente du théâtre en français avec des sous-titres en anglais, par exemple, pour que ça soit plus inclusif, pour que les francophiles ou même les anglophones qui sont intéressés par ces pièces de théâtre-là, mais qui ne se sentiraient peut-être pas à l'aise d'écouter cette pièce-là, cette pièce de théâtre-là sans avoir un appui, peut-être qu'on ne les verrait pas chez nous. Mais d'un autre côté, il y a un danger à ouvrir ces portes-là. Puis on l'a vu, par exemple, avec l'expérience des écoles bilingues dans les années 1970, surtout dans les milieux où la langue majoritaire est l'anglais, c'est que ces écoles-là devenaient des foyers d'assimilation. D'avoir et de maintenir des espaces d'autonomie, des espaces publics qui sortent de l'extérieur du foyer familial, où les choses se passent en français, ça demeure primordial. Et c'est là où je pense qu'il y a une tension qui n'est pas facile pour les francophones en situation minoritaire de dire « Oui, on veut être ouvert, on veut être inclusif, mais au détriment de quoi? » Et là, il y a toujours des réflexions à faire, je pense, mais de trouver le juste équilibre, c'est franchement pas facile.
You know what I'm noticing, which is kind of funny? I know we're going back and forth between French and English, and I don't know if anybody in the control room is running a stopwatch on this, but it feels like a lot more French is being spoken here than English, and I think it's because French is just a lot more fun to speak than English. You think that's happening?
Actually, Steve, it's so you don't understand what we're saying.
Maybe that's
I'm
why it's
picking up
fun.
more of this than you think. It's not too bad.
Une des choses, en fait, un des problèmes, je crois, c'est la nature même de la langue. Le fait est que l'anglais, de par son histoire, et c'est plus facile d'apprendre l'anglais. Par exemple, au début de l'émission, je demandais à nos invités, est-ce que je vous vois ou je vous tutoie? Cette petite nuance est perdue en anglais. Une chose de moins à apprendre pour bien parler anglais. En anglais, c'est you. Que ce soit la reine ou le dieu ou mon enfant, c'est you.
It's His Majesty.
It's his-